My name is Esther Peters, and I'm the Interim Associate Director at the Center for East European and Russian Eurasian Studies at the University of Chicago. I'm joined today by Bozena Shallcross, a professor in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literature, also at the University of Chicago. And we're really excited to have the opportunity to talk today with Dr. Eva Hoffman, who is the author of many books, including Lost in Translation, A Life in New Language, Shtetl, The Life and Death of a Small Town and the World of Polish Jews, Time, Big Ideas, Small Books, and most recently, How to Be Bored. I thought we'd start with just a few, as I said, a few questions about your creative process a little bit. And so I wondered if you could describe what the main force in your writing is.
My main force is being compelled by a subject, is wanting to explore a subject and excavate, understand its full meanings. So I really start with a preoccupation and with a relationship to a subject. And for me, the genre follows from a subject. So I have written in different genres. I have kind of skipped and hopped around, but it's absolutely because different themes, different subjects demand different genres.
That kind of actually ties well into my second question then, although I might return to this connection between the compulsion or the interest in the object and how that leads to genre. But before that, how do you perceive your writing changing over time? Or has it?
Well, no, it has changed a whole lot. Do you mean what I have written, or do you mean my writing process?
Let's start with your writing process. Like, how is, do you have a regular process? Has that changed, or?
I am very irregular with my process. But I guess, the one thing that I can say is that my first book was, in a way, the hardest to write.
Okay.
And I talked about this, in the workshop yesterday. And it wasn't because of the writing. It was because it was my first non-journalistic, non-academic book in English. And I wasn't sure that I had full entitlement to the language, that I had the full right to write in English. And that, created a surprising amount of anxiety. So a lot of anxiety was about that, who am I to write in a personal voice in English? Will it be understood? Is it a voice at all? I didn't sort of know my voice. So that was the hardest. From then on, I don't, writing is always very hard. It requires a certain degree of tolerance for anxiety and stress, etc. But I don't think it has been quite that hard. Now, there is also quite a difference between fiction and nonfiction.
Yes. And
they have different kinds of difficulty. The wonderful thing about nonfiction is that you have material to work from. You know that there is a body of something that you can draw on to write. Mm-hmm. But the sort of the problem, the difficulty is how to make it meaningful and how to make a shape out of it, how to give it shape and structure and meanings. With fiction, I have sometimes felt that I am wading into a body of water and drawing lines, and then the lines disappear, and I have to start all over again. In other words, at any one point, fiction can go in 17 different directions. So it's a kind of imaginative problem, imaginative difficulty. But, there are also great pleasures in writing fiction and nonfiction, but there are great pleasures in writing fiction, enormous pleasures. When you do find your voice, when you do find, what you're writing about, which, at some point becomes clear and it accumulates, when you find, the voice, which, for your novel, there is an enormous pleasure, and it can sort of take off, and it can really sort of take off almost beyond you. There is a bit of that effect, yeah.
It's if I can, I'm going to go off script just a little bit in the questions I had thought about beforehand, and you talked about the ways in which your genre is born out of the object you're interested in, or the subject matter you're interested in, that you get interested in that subject, and then that leads you to genre. I'm interested, is there a kind of process there, and maybe more specifically, how does that lead then to, say, fiction as opposed to nonfiction?
Well, again, I mean, the choice of genre was oddly enough most problematic in my first book, first book, because I didn't have it in mind to write a memoir to start out with. I am not of a very confessional temperament, really, and I didn't want to write, a confessional book.
Okay.
I thought maybe of writing about Eastern European writers in exile. As we know, this could have been a very rich subject. I thought of writing about, problems of language and second language itself. I thought even of writing a novel about it. And then I realized that what I wanted to write about was the intersection of these abstract entities, culture and language, and self, and internal life. And that I had to have a case study for it. And that the case study I had was myself.
So actually, this book is not a memoir.
Yeah.
It is clearly an autobiographical essay.
Yeah.
Because I located within the tradition that comes from Michel Montaigne's essay. Yeah. This combination of the personal outlook and deep thought, philosophy.
Well, the memoir genre has wonderful possibilities for this. It can precisely, combine, the personal and the wider reflections.
It's your project, actually, generically speaking, is a hybrid.
Right. Yes. I think you're right. Yeah.
Well, for the last, at least of my early questions, I'd kind of like to go back to these larger themes or influences in your writing and ask about are there people, places, books that have influenced your writing?
Well, it's hard to be specific because, I studied literature. I read a lot of literature. A lot of it, has been sort of incorporated, into my imaginative and intellectual life. So it's hard to pull out particular threads. When I was writing Lost in Translation, the book which was most important for me was Speak Memory, Nabokov's Speak Memory.
Wonderful.
Yeah. First of all, because it partly does deal with, transculturation and questions of language. And it sort of, reassured me. And a lost world and all of that. And it sort of reassured me that in fact that was a subject because this was the other thing that I was uncertain about. Is this actually a subject? Okay. So yeah.
I think you might, Bozena might have a follow-up on that in terms of some specific influences or thoughts.
Actually, what strikes me in your writing, the beginning of the first book, is something that you are seldom asked about, and this is the material dimension in your life, in your thoughts, in your thought process, the way you describe your transformation from a Polish girl into a Canadian American girl, all the details, the places where you lived or visited, the quality of her, all this, it is visual, but it's also and probably mostly material. There is this physicalness to your representation of the world.
I mean, I'm not sure I can account for it because it's it's not something I try to do. It's it emanates from, I guess, from my sort of temperament. But perhaps one thing that I could say about it is that my memories and lost in translation came from childhood, and childhood is a time in which your experiences are very sensual and physical. You don't yet have ideological explanations for your experiences. You don't have, theoretical explanations for your experiences. So and those were, very powerful and very formative memories. And in a way, when I emigrated, the transformation also came at that kind of age. And so I suppose
the palpability comes from the child sensitivity.
I think so. I think so. Yeah, I think so.
Well, I do not suspect any kind of a materialist philosophy behind the book, Marxist or Bergsonian, not at all.
Yeah.
But there is this need to establish certain truths about the world and the people who inhabit that space. Planted, for example. Oh my gosh! In your book.
Yes.
The light there, just the whole aura.
Yes. Well, I think that must be just simply a question of temperament and my particular sort of way of perceiving the world. But I do think it. That insofar as we're talking about my memories of Poland, it is because childhood experiences are incredibly intense and incredibly specific and incredibly sensuous. I think.
Yeah, but it's really not only about this. I think there is a certain continuity. It goes on to the scenes and episodes in Manhattan, and it's I guess your personality and your eye.
I suppose, in my way of experiencing. But thank you. I'm pleased to hear this.
Yeah. That question that is tied to the sense of space and the sense of belonging to some place. You spend a lot of time flying, being at airports. These are non-spaces of supermodernity. But you also have your home now in London. What kind of belonging do you have when you are happily, comfortably ensconced in your home in London? What is it?
I feel the sense that I don't need to leave again. This is mainly what I feel. And also it happens to be a place which suits me very well. It just, suits me. Now, my sort of joke formulation for it, as I sort of said yesterday, is that, London is my midway point between Manhattan and Krakow. And it really, it really is along so many parameters.
It is a great place. It's a hub.
And it's a great place. Yeah, and one of the things that that suits me, about the area where I live, but this is true in many areas of London, is that there is complete urban life half a block away from me. But where I live, it's a very quiet street with 3-story houses and gardens in it. Very few cities, very few cosmopolitan cities have this anymore.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a kind of quality of London.
Chicago does.
Chicago does.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
New York City is
New
also
York doesn't. Paris really doesn't.
All
Yeah.
right. Very, very seldom.
Yeah.
When it comes
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
this.
So and so it just, and there is something about the sensibility which suits me, and people the Polish-British relationship right now is complicated in many political ways, but actually it has been noted before that there is some affinity, actually, sense of irony, for example.
Oh boy. Yes.
So yes, we'll go no further with this. Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah. So, yes.
I'll tell you one more thing about London, and when I first went there. I'm less conscious of it now, but one of the things that I was conscious of is that the Second World War figured there. Figured in people's, sensibilities and memories, the way it sort of didn't in Canada, for example.
Oh yes.
Yeah. In other words, that past was meaningful, and oddly enough,
Very much.
that matters somehow, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah.
Interesting. London is one of the spaces that were destroyed during World War II. Krakow wasn't.
Yes.
Luckily,
Yes.
it really is an odd, it almost a freak accident. Krakow was
Yes.
not destroyed. Nonetheless, both places have the same attraction of the old,
Yes.
of the past,
Yes.
of protecting the legacy.
Yes.
And the legacy is actually very important, very big thing for you.
Yes.
As the survivor, because I think you are really a survivor of the Holocaust. Look, you were born a few months after.
I know, but I don't think of myself as a survivor. I'm sorry, I did not experience the Holocaust.
Well, you don't know about the mystery of. Her mother was already pregnant.
Your mother was what, sorry?
No,
your
your mother
was what? I thought, yeah. My mother was...
Pregnant during the.
I know, and we now talk about the epigenetic, transmission.
But you don't accept that.
Well, I accept the epigenetic transmission. I do, because it's a transmission of certain possibly. They're still studying it, but possibly
Yes.
it is a transmission of certain kinds of anxieties, for example.
Or joys.
Of what?
Or joys. There are mothers who sing to their children.
Well, yeah.
They,
But I
you
mean,
know,
in relation to
like
the
in your
Holocaust,
case.
in relation to the
Right.
Holocaust, for example. But it is not a transmission of memories,
No.
and it is not a transmission of experience, and it is a very, it is a transmission of a certain sense of experiences. A passage of the
Very
sort of the
interesting.
consequences
Right.
of those experiences. But I didn't experience these
No.
things.
No, there
So-
was only the biological existence.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
We
which
just-
of course, I mean, it is a very deep transmission, and I'll talk about this in my lecture a little bit.
Wonderful.
It is a very deep transmission,
Mhm.
but I am not a survivor. I did not go through what my parents
No.
went through.
No, not at all in this
Yeah.
sense, but there are many ways of understanding survival, and there are people who survived the Holocaust, but they didn't really. They like Pochlebnik in Lanzmann's show.
Yeah.
He says that he died
Yeah, Yeah.
at the
Yeah. Yeah.
in the woods of Kulmhof, and so
There is a long aftermath. I mean, the aftermath and the passage of this experience
it's always
is very long,
yeah.
and we're the aftermath is what I feel.
Right.
Uh,
Right,
So
right.
yeah.
The older I get, the more I'm attached to the oral history
Uh-huh.
of World War II
Uh-huh.
and the Holocaust.
Uh-huh.
In every possible ethnic or national version,
Uh-huh.
I tend to talk to people about this. I want to know their stories.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
It's just a certain thing that I developed. So
Do you feel that's as a part of you getting older, or part of the recognition that those histories, those
me
oral
getting
histories,
mature.
well, but those oral histories are being lost, right? Or there's fewer and fewer people who are around to tell those oral
And
histories.
they very often do not want to talk. I know a few people who were the Baltendeutsch.
Mhm.
They came from the Baltic,
Mhm.
today's Latvian, and they were transferred during the war, at the beginning of the war, literally, to various Polish cities. My family went through that. They were, expelled from their house, and a German family was installed in their house. But people like that, those who profited from the war, in this case and other cases, do not want to.
Of course.
No,
And
they
of course,
do
yeah.
not want to.
Oh,
It's-
yes, of course. It's a very vexed,
Absolutely.
difficult,
And they
history. Yeah.
profited. They took the Jewish property, they took the Polish property, and Poles then took the German property, etc., etc. There was this constant stealing, grabbing of stuff, and yet this is almost the most shameful thing
Yeah.
after killing.
Mhm.
Truly.
Yeah, it is it's very shameful. It is shameful.
Yeah. On the more spiritual level,
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, and I would like to use the the words that Szymborska used in one of her poems about soul shards, and when you think of the family of yours that you will never know, when those, like your 19-year-old aunt who perished, do you somehow feel a connection, and a sort of an inner connection with them?
Well, I
Because
mean,
she's the most
yeah, she was the
individualized, right?
well because she was
your
the
mother.
most. Yeah, she was the one whom my mother mourned most
Yeah.
deeply. So it was yes. Well, so this is where I think the passage happens and is very, and is complicated to describe because I felt I was in mourning for my mother's sister. I mourned her death with my mother, but I didn't know her, of course. And, as you probably remember from my book, I had this fantasy when I was a child that I would go and find her somewhere, that she didn't die, that I would, repair this great loss, that I would bring her back to my mother. So my sense of connection was, this is where it gets, quite strange, and this is where, the second generation has its particular kind of relationship to this experience, which is very deep and can be very, full of its own kind of pain.
Oh, certainly.
Yeah, but which again is not the experience itself. Do I feel a connection to them now? I don't think about it every day, You know,
Of
I mean, in
course,
other words, you know, it is not that kind of connection. When I went to the shtetl, to the village where my
Right.
parents grew up, and saw the sites of, you know, I was shown the place where my parents were hidden. I mean, it was completely amazing. And I was shown the place where my mother's sister died. You know, they had to dig their own graves. I saw the place, you know, where my father buried his two brothers by himself. I didn't learn this till later, because they died, you know, at the end. So, you know, in a way, because when you receive all of this as a child, it's hard. It's very deep and very profound, but it also seems like a sort of fable, you know. So it grounded it in absolute reality. It gave it an absolute reality, and perhaps it made me sort of accept the fact that no, I do not have grandparents, and these people have died, and this is, you know, this is my legacy. This is, yeah.
So it's a cruel fable.
Oh, it
cruel
is a cruel fable. Yeah. It is worse than Brothers Grimm. Yeah. Yeah.
So the question that I perceive as a delicate question is that I always, after reading, especially your three books, After Such Knowledge and Shtetl and the first book, I had a feeling that you have done a lot to defy a monolithically negative perception of Poles, that this is what totally dominates. Well, I know a bit about New York City and Chicago and Bloomington. Those three cities, and I meet in Poland very often Israeli Jews, Canadian Jews, American Jews. They do have a one-dimensional view of Poland, and I am always very surprised when it is not the case. The girl who yesterday found the clock, Melanie, is one of those wonderful people who do not accept that. Right. And so was the student who took the course and read your book, who died last summer, who was totally against anti-Polandism. But I didn't want to talk about anti-Polandism. I wanted to talk about your personal courage, because I am sure that not everybody likes your.
Yes. No, I got a lot of avid objections to this book. And this book, you know, speaking of genres, I mean, my impulse partly was polemical. It was absolutely polemical. I wanted precisely to counter, you know, this very monolithic and it seemed to me very simplistic view of Poland and of Polish Jewish history. You know, and I wanted to counter it. It was incredibly powerful at the time when I was, you know, thinking about Shtetl and writing Shtetl. I think it has changed to some extent now. But it was very powerful, but it was accompanied by a complete ignorance of this history, you know, including actually, you know, my ignorance of this history, except that I understood enough, I knew enough to know that this was a very simplified version. You know.
But then you rewrote that history.
Yeah. Well, yes, and it was, yes. I mean, I didn't know enough, and you know, it was a great pleasure to research it further and to find out, you know, more. But you know, the history is surrounded by ignorance. You know, was surrounded by
on both sides.
On both sides, yes. And so I wanted, to show the complexity of this history. So yes, and yes, there were occasionally, when I talked to audiences, it was not easy. But I think there was a change, at least for a while.
Slight change, yeah.
I think there was a change, and of course, partly what influenced this sort of sense of complete rupture between Poles and Jews was the Iron Curtain. That until 1989.
Totally. There is this absolutely shameful chapter that communists wrote, and for me it starts with that Auschwitz inscription. When I was a child of 14, I had to go on an obligatory mandatory excursion to Auschwitz, and we stood by the famous gate, and next to it is, as you probably know and remember, was this inscription, which said exactly, było nas 3 miliony. There were 3 millions of us. And the list goes on. Albanians, Greeks, French, German, Polish, Ukrainian, blah, blah, blah. There is not a word of Jews.
There is not even a word.
Now it is. Now it is, because it was one of the first things after the communist system collapsed was to try to change history books, textbooks, and such artifacts like this stone inscription. But that's what people perceived. I was struck because I lived in a town where a certain neighborhood was called Judenberg.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Where?
In Rawicz.
Uh-huh.
There was, and it was actually a very beautiful part of the city. Anyway, I knew what it was, but mostly children who were 14, just accepted as truth that there was not a single Jew there. I mean, that Jews didn't exist, in fact, at all. Because, and this was the largest Jewish cemetery in the world. So that was such a horrible lie that it's one of the worst manipulations.
Yeah,
and those people were.
So yes, so from the Polish side, Jews were a completely erased entity, and from the Jewish side, the side of the Jewish immigrants in America and Israel, Poland was not accessible. It was this kind of dark place behind the Iron Curtain, a place of which was imagined as kind of an inferno.
I am smiling because in 1971, when I went to Krakow to study at Jagiellonian University, I walked on a little street called Świętego Józefa, which is in the Jewish, former Jewish district.
I know it well, yes.
District?
Yes.
And I was there first time. I was walking with my friend, and it was the first time that we saw an absolutely amazing image in front of us. There was a group of Hasidic men with huge fox hats, dressed in their best, in very elegant colors and
their Saturday best.
Saturday best, right. The synagogue best, and it will never happen again. But it was really a recreated, like for me, a recreated moment of history, because that was their street, it was their space in Krakow, but they came from the United States. It was 1978. It was very rare.
Yes,
that they would
it would have been
travel.
very rare, yes.
I bet.
Yes, but
What a luck. as far as I'm concerned. I'm sorry for
No,
talking
no.
about this,
No,
but
no. Yes, no, because there was a complete erasure. Yeah.
totally.
Yeah.
Well, on that rather serious and somber note, perhaps we'll wrap up with a difficult but more lighthearted question.
Okay.
So the way we've been finishing these interviews in our series is to ask our wonderful visiting scholars and guests and authors to recommend 3 books that they think everyone should read. What are 3 books that have meant a lot to you, that you would say should go on that list of what it means to, what people should read, right, if you're looking for a good book?
Well, to pick 3 books out of the 3,000.
However many you want. You keep listing.
But I mean, I mentioned Nabokov, and you
Mhm.
know, he really is a kind of lodestar for me.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, he was again a kind of companion when I wrote my book about time.
Mm-hmm.
So Speak Memory is, you know, is certainly one of the books which is very important to me. Oh dear, I really should pick a book on, you know, on the subject about which we're speaking, and so I will mention Primo Levi.
Okay.
If this is a man, you know, his memoir about his experiences in Auschwitz, which are exceptional, you know, among survivor memoirs, in that he had sort of, you know, the means of analysis and understanding to try to understand the structure of, you know, Auschwitz. And what enabled Auschwitz. You know, he tried to understand the structure of it. He tried to understand this gray zone, you know, in which the Jewish prisoners, you know, didn't always behave well, and what, you know, what enabled that, what made that possible. And of course, you know, what he reminds us of is that, you know, there was this famous saying by Adorno, that poetry after Auschwitz, there is no poetry. Well, there was poetry in Auschwitz.
Right.
You know, I mean, Primo Levi, you know, drew on poetry, derived great consolation from poetry. So, Primo Levi. Now, I must say that the other book which springs immediately to mind, but you know, I mean, it's yes. I feel slightly foolish, really, because there are, you know, so many books.
It's a type of a question.
But
This is a good question to spring on people. But
yeah. But it's, you know, it's a novel which I have returned to, and it's Anna Karenina. Which I simply think is a miraculous work. I mean, I think it's just simply a miraculous work of fiction. And, you know, what is miraculous about it, I feel, is its quality of utter truthfulness. And, you know, of utter, in other words, he stays so close to his characters as to be speaking from within them at every moment of this novel. So there is, you know, that kind of truthfulness, and, you know, then of course the fantastic breadth of the social canvas. So yeah, it is a novel which I do say is just a miracle. So yes, so there we are. Yeah.
Excellent. Well,
yeah.
thank you very much for talking with us today. That was excellent.